The crystal corridors had never been so quiet. Even the walls, which usually hummed with a soft blue glow, seemed dimmer now, as if the palace itself was grieving. Thousands of Selvari citizens stood along the streets outside. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply watched as two glass coffins floated through the air, carried by invisible currents of energy, moving slowly toward the great ceremony hall at the center of the royal palace of Selvar. Inside those coffins lay King Yudin and Queen Solen. Their violet skin had turned pale. Their silver eyes were closed forever. To the front of the hall, standing alone on a raised platform, was their daughter, Princess Rena. She was barely 7 cycles old. Her skin was a lighter shade of violet than her parents'. Her wide silver eyes glowed faintly, the way all young Selvari eyes did when they were afraid. Two small, delicate antennae rose from her forehead, but today they hung limp and lifeless against her hair. She did not cry. She had been taught better than that. Royal grief must remain invisible. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. She stood perfectly still and watched her parents float past her for the last time. Behind her, Chancellor Morven stepped forward. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and dark violet skin that was almost black. His silver eyes held no warmth. He placed one long hand on the edge of the podium and began to speak. His voice filled the hall. He praised the king's wisdom. He praised the queen's grace. He spoke of loss and legacy and the strength of the Selvari people. Every word was perfect. Every sentence was polished. And every single one of them was hollow. Morven had arranged the assassination himself. A quiet poison, delivered through the ventilation system of the royal bedchamber. Undetectable, untraceable. The official report blamed a malfunction in the air filtration system. No one questioned it. No one dared. Now Morven stood before the people and declared himself acting regent until the princess came of age. The crowd outside listened in silence. The counselors inside nodded. It was the proper procedure. It was the law. Rena did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the coffins as they descended into the floor of the hall, sinking into the deep burial vaults beneath the palace. When they disappeared from view, something inside her went with them. After the ceremony, the hall emptied slowly. Morven lingered. He stood near the edge of the burial vault and looked down into the darkness below. Then he turned and walked into a private chamber where 3 of his closest allies waited. He closed the door behind him. His expression changed. The grief vanished. The softness vanished. What remained was cold and precise. "The child is a problem," he said simply. "Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. She carries the bloodline." The people love that bloodline more than they love any chancellor. One of his allies, a broad-shouldered Selvari named Dunn, leaned forward. "Then remove her." "Not yet," Morven said. "If she dies now, there will be questions. Suspicion. We must be patient. Isolate her. Keep her away from anyone who might rally support around her. Let her fade. Let her break. And when the time is right, we declare her unfit to rule." They agreed. The plan was simple. Starve the child of connection. Surround her with strangers. Let grief do the rest. In another part of the palace, far from the ceremony hall, an old Selvari elder sat alone in a small room filled with books and star maps. His name was Fennis. He had served the king and queen for 40 years. His body was frail now, his hands shaking, his eyes clouded. But his mind was still sharp. He had watched Morven's rise with growing dread. He had no proof of the assassination. He had no army. He had no political allies strong enough to challenge the chancellor. But he had one thing Morven did not expect. He had a plan. Fennis opened a file on his data screen. It was a personnel transfer request from the Galactic Labor Exchange, a program that brought workers from across the galaxy to fill domestic roles on various worlds. One name was highlighted: Doris Wynn, human, age 56, former domestic worker, mother of 4. Fennis had requested her specifically, not for her skills, not for her experience, but because she was human. And humans, Fennis had learned over his long life, had a gift that no other species in the galaxy seemed to possess. They could love children that were not their own, truly love them, not out of duty, not out of obligation, but out of something deep and instinctive that the Selvari had never fully understood. He approved the transfer and closed the file. 3 days later, a transport shuttle landed on the palace docking platform. The doors opened, and a short, round woman with graying hair and a worn travel bag stepped out. She looked up at the enormous crystal towers of the palace, shielding her eyes against the violet sun. Doris Wynn had never been off Earth before. She had taken this job to send money home to her grown children. She expected to clean floors and wash linens for a few years, then return to her small house outside Liverpool. She did not know about the dead king and queen. She did not know about the chancellor or his plans. She did not know that somewhere deep inside this palace, a little girl with silver eyes was sitting alone in the dark, slowly disappearing. But she was here now, and that was going to change everything. 7 days had passed since the funeral, and not a single sound had come from the princess. The Selvari attendants assigned to care for her rotated in shifts. They brought food. They changed the linens. They stood in the corners of her enormous bedroom and waited for instructions that never came. Rena sat on the floor near the far wall, her knees pulled to her chest, her silver eyes open but seeing nothing. Her antennae hung flat. She did not eat. She did not sleep for more than a few minutes at a time, and she did not speak. One by one, the attendants asked to be reassigned. Some were afraid of what Morven might do if they grew too close to the child. Others simply could not bear the silence. A grief-locked Selvari child was difficult to watch. The species felt emotions deeply, more deeply than most races in the galaxy, and when a young Selvari fell into what the physicians called a grief spiral, it could cause permanent damage. The mind would fold in on itself. Memory would blur. Personality would fade. If the spiral was not interrupted, the child could lose herself entirely, and one seemed able to interrupt it. Doris Wynn had been working in the palace for 5 days. Her duties were simple. She cleaned the outer chambers of the royal quarters, polished the crystal panels along the corridor walls, and collected the linens left outside the sealed bedroom doors. She was not permitted to enter the inner rooms. She was not permitted to speak to the princess. She was in every way invisible. She did not mind. The work was steady. The palace was beautiful in a strange and unsettling way, and the pay was enough to send a decent amount back to Earth each month. She kept her head down and did her job. That on her second night, everything changed. She was folding linens in a storage alcove near the royal quarters when she heard it. A thin, high-pitched sound, barely louder than a whisper. It came from behind the sealed doors at the end of the corridor. At first she thought it was a mechanical noise, some piece of alien equipment vibrating at an odd frequency. But then it shifted, rising and falling in a pattern that was too uneven, too raw, to be a machine. That IT was a child crying. Not the way human children cried, with sobs and hiccups and wailing. This was different. It was a continuous, keening tone that seemed to come from deep inside the body, as if the sound was being pulled out against the child's will. Doris set down the linens. She walked to the sealed door. There were no guards posted at this hour. The night attendant had already left, as they always did. She pressed her hand to the door panel, and to her surprise, it slid open. The lock had not been properly set. The room beyond was enormous and dark. Silver light filtered through tall windows that looked out over the crystal city. Doris stepped inside and followed the sound. She found Rena in the far corner, curled into a ball on the bare floor. The child was shaking so hard that the tremors were visible even in the dim light. Her silver eyes were wide open but completely unfocused. Her antennae trembled like leaves in a storm. The keening sound came from her throat in waves, each one weaker than the last. Doris did not know what a grief spiral was. She did not know that the Selvari medical texts described it as a potentially fatal condition in young children. She did not know the protocols for intervention, which involved specific frequencies of sound and carefully controlled physical contact administered by trained professionals. She knew none of that. What she knew was that a little girl was alone on the floor in the dark, shaking and crying, and no one was with her. Doris lowered herself to the floor. Her knees protested. She was not young anymore, and the cold crystal surface was hard against her bones. She sat about an arm's length from the child and folded her hands in her lap. She did not touch her. She did not speak. She simply sat there, breathing steadily, and waited. Minutes passed. The keening continued, but Doris did not flinch. She had sat through nights like this before, for children of her own, and each of them had known darkness at some point. Nightmares, fevers. The year her youngest son lost his best friend in a car accident and would not come out of his room for 2 weeks. Doris had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do for a suffering child was simply to be present. Not to fix, not to explain, just to stay. After a long while, she began to hum. It was a lullaby, an old one. Her own mother had sung it to her in a small house in Liverpool decades ago. The melody was simple, rising and falling in gentle waves, and Doris hummed it softly, almost under her breath. The keening slowed. Not all at once, but gradually the way a storm fades. Rena's trembling eased. Her antennae, which had been flat against her head, lifted slightly. The glow in her silver eyes flickered, dimmed, then steadied. For the first time in 7 days, the child turned her head and looked at another living being. She looked at Doris. Doris met her gaze. She did not smile too wide. She did not reach out. She simply let the child see her, plain and unhurried. Then she whispered very softly, "I'm here, my child." Rena did not respond. She did not speak, but she did not look away either. And when Doris finally rose to leave an hour later, she noticed that the shaking had stopped completely. The child's breathing was slow and even. Her antennae rested gently against her hair. Rena was asleep. For the first time in 7 days, she was truly asleep. Doris pulled a blanket from the bed, draped it carefully over the small violet body, and stepped out of the room without a sound. A folded cloth bird sat on the windowsill of the princess's bedroom. It was small and clumsy, made from a cleaning rag that Doris had shaped with her fingers during a break. She had left it there the morning after that first night, tucked between the glass and the frame, where someone sweeping the room might not notice ITWY afternoon. It was gone from the windowsill. Doris found it later, clutched in Rena's small hands as the child sat on the floor in her usual spot near the wall. That was how it started. Every day, Doris found small ways to reach the child. She was still not permitted inside the inner chambers during official hours. Her role was to clean the outer rooms, nothing more. But the night locks on the inner doors were never properly set, and the night attendants never stayed past their shift. So Doris came in the late hours, after her duties were finished, and she sat with Rena in the dark. She did not push. She did not try to make the child speak or eat or move. She simply existed nearby. She hummed. She folded cloth animals and left them in places Rena would find them. She placed a cup of warm broth on the floor within arm's reach and then turned away, pretending to adjust a curtain dot on the 4th night. Rena drank the broth dot on the 6th night. Doris arrived to find the child sitting near the door instead of in her corner. As if she had been waiting. The change was slow but steady. Rena's antennae began to lift during Doris's visits. The dull emptiness in her silver eyes softened into something cautious but alive. She still did not speak, but she watched Doris with an intensity that was almost startling, tracking every movement, every gesture, as if memorizing the shape of this strange, warm creature who kept appearing in the dark point 3 weeks in. Morven noticed he had been monitoring the princess through the Selvari attendants who checked on her during the day. The reports had been consistent. The child was unresponsive. She was fading. This was exactly what he wanted. A broken princess was no threat to his regency. But the latest report was different. The daytime attendant noted that the princess had eaten a small meal, that her antennae were partially raised, that she had been found sitting near the window rather than in her corner. Morven summoned the attendant. "What changed?" he asked. The attendant hesitated. "There is a human servant, a cleaning woman. She has been seen near the royal quarters at unusual hours." Morven's expression did not change, but something behind his silver eyes tightened. He gave an order. The human maid was to be reassigned to the lower kitchens immediately. No contact with the royal floor. No exceptions. The order reached the palace staff office that same evening. Doris was informed by a Selvari supervisor who barely looked at her. New assignment. Lower kitchens. Report tomorrow morning. But before the reassignment could take effect, Advisor Finney's intervened. The old elder had been watching from a distance, carefully tracking both Morven's moves and the quiet changes in Rena's condition. He appeared at the staff office with a medical recommendation, stamped with the seal of the Royal Physician's Archive. It stated that the princess required environmental stability during her recovery, and that no changes to the domestic staff on the royal floor should be made without consultation. It was a thin shield. Morven could overrule it if he pressed, but it would require a formal challenge, and Morven did not want to draw attention to his interest in the princess's care arrangements. Not yet, so he allowed the human to stay, for now. But he placed a Selvari monitor in the royal quarters, a silent watcher named Gavra, whose only job was to observe and report. Captain Brielle Ashford noticed it too. She commanded the small team of 6 human security guards stationed at the palace, contracted through a galactic security firm. Her team's duties were routine, guarding secondary entrances and running night patrols. But Ashford was not a routine person. She had spent 15 years in military security before taking the private contract, and she had a sharp instinct for danger. She had watched Morven's rise with quiet suspicion. She had noted the speed with which the assassination investigation had been closed. And now she noticed the monitor placed in the royal quarters and the quiet tension around the princess's care. She began keeping her own records. Patrol routes adjusted to pass the royal corridor more frequently. Notes written in a small book she kept inside her jacket. She did not act. Not yet. But she was paying attention. Meanwhile, Rena continued to change. The cloth animals multiplied on her windowsill. She ate small meals. She slept more than she had in weeks. And one evening, as Dora sat beside her humming the old lullaby, the child opened her mouth and spoke one word. A Selvari word. Doris did not understand the language. She had no translator with her, and the palace translation systems did not extend to the private chambers. But the word was sola. It meant warm. Rena said it while looking directly at Doris. Her silver eyes glowed softly. Her antennae were raised and still. She said the word once, clearly, and then went quiet again. Doris did not understand the meaning, but she understood the tone. She smiled gently and said, "You are warm too, little one." Rena's antennae twitched. The faintest glow brightened in her eyes. It was not a smile. Selvari children did not smile the way human children did. But it was something close, something alive. That night, Gavra filed his report to Chancellor Morven. The princess was recovering. She had spoken her first word. She was bonding with a human servant. Morven read the report in silence. Then he closed the screen and sat in the dark for a very long time. A recovering princess was not part of his plan. 6 weeks after the assassination, Chancellor Morven stood before a mirror in his private chambers and rehearsed the words he would use to end a child's future. The princess suffers from irreversible grief deterioration. The royal physicians have confirmed that her cognitive and emotional faculties are permanently compromised. It is with deep sadness that I recommend the council begin proceedings to formally remove her from the line of succession. He said it 3 times, each time smoother, each time more convincing. The sadness in his voice sounded almost real. The plan was already in motion. He had assembled a panel of 4 Selvari physicians, each of them loyal to him through debts or threats or both. They would examine the princess in 2 days. Their conclusion was already written. All they needed was to observe the child long enough to make the report look legitimate. But first, the human maid had to go. Morven had tolerated her presence for too long. The old advisor Finney's had blocked the first reassignment with a medical recommendation, but Morven had found a way around it. He issued a new order, not through the palace staff office, but through the Galactic Labor Exchange itself. The human's work contract was to be reviewed for compliance violations. Pending review, she would be removed from the palace and held at the Exchange Processing Center in orbit. It was clean. It was bureaucratic, and it would take Doris Wynn off the planet entirely. The order would arrive in 48 hours. Just before the physicians conducted their evaluation, that same evening, Doris was turned away from the royal quarters. Two guards stood at the corridor entrance. They were polite but firm. New security protocols. No domestic staff permitted on the royal floor after sunset. Chancellor's orders. Doris stood in the corridor for a long moment, looking at the sealed doors. Then she turned and walked away. But she did not go far. She went to the lower kitchen, sat at a table in the corner, and thought. She was not a clever woman, not in the way that politicians and chancellors were clever. But she had raised 4 children, and she knew what it looked like when someone was trying to separate a child from the person who cared about them. She had seen it in custody battles. She had seen it in her own family. And she knew that silence was never the right response. She could not get through the guards. She could not override palace security. But she could still reach the child. The next morning, she tucked a small folded cloth bird into a stack of clean linens being delivered to the royal floor. She knew the routine. She knew which cart went where. The bird would end up in Rena's room if the daytime attendant placed the linens in the usual spot. That afternoon, Gavra's report noted that the princess had been found holding a cloth figure. Origin unknown. That evening, Doris walked the corridor outside the royal quarters during her approved cleaning shift. She could not enter, but the walls of the palace were crystal, and crystal carried sound. She pressed close to the wall and began to hum. The same lullaby, low and steady. Inside the sealed quarters, Rena heard it. Her antennae rose sharply. She turned toward the wall. She pressed her small violet hands against the smooth surface and whispered a single word. Sola. Warm, far from the royal quarters, in a maintenance corridor on the lower levels. Captain Ashford received an unexpected visitor. Advisor Phineas appeared at her door, moving slowly, leaning on a cane. His silver eyes were red-rimmed. He looked as if he had not slept in days. Ashford let him in. She locked the door. Phineas sat down heavily and told her everything. He told her about the poison in the ventilation system. He told her about Morven's manipulation of the investigation. He told her about the false physicians and the plan to declare Rena unfit. And he told her about the contract review that would remove Doris from the planet within 2 days. Why come to me? Ashford asked. Because you are human, Phineas said simply, and because I have watched your kind for many years. You do not abandon children. It is not in your nature. Ashford sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Do you have proof? Morven keeps his communications in a private archive. Encrypted. But I know the access codes. I served the royal household for 40 years. The old codes were never changed. Ashford looked at him. If the codes work and the evidence is there, I can get it out. But if we move and fail, he will kill the princess. You know that. Phineas nodded. If we do not move, he will destroy her anyway. Just slowly. Ashford made her decision in the silence that followed. She did not announce it. She simply stood, opened a locked drawer, and began assembling a data extraction kit. 2 days, she said. We move the night before the physicians arrive. Phineas nodded again. He rose to leave, then paused at the door. The maid, he said. Doris. She does not know any of this. She is simply a woman who heard a child crying and refused to walk away. I know, Ashford said. That is exactly why she matters. Back in the royal quarters, Rena sat alone. The guards had not allowed anyone inside since sunset. The room was dark. The cloth bird sat in her lap. She held it with both hands and stared at the wall where she had heard the humming. The humming had stopped hours ago. The corridor was empty. But Rena did not move from her spot near the wall. She stayed there all night, her antennae raised, her silver eyes glowing faintly, listening for a sound that did not come, waiting for the warm voice to return. Ashford moved at 3 hours past midnight, when the palace was at its quietest and the guard rotations left a 12-minute gap on the eastern wing. She took 2 of her team with her. Corporal Nile, a tall man with steady hands who had done covert data work before, and Sergeant Fay, who could pick apart alien security systems the way most people open tin cans. They wore their standard uniforms. No these gaises. If they were caught, they would claim a routine security sweep. It would not hold up under questioning, but it would buy time. Phineas had given them the access codes to Morven's private archive. The archive was located in a sealed chamber behind the chancellor's office, protected by 3 layers of encryption and a biometric lock. The biometric lock was keyed to the royal household's senior staff. Phineas's handprint still worked. He had confirmed it 2 days ago. They reached the eastern wing without incident. The corridors were empty. Fate bypassed the outer door in under a minute. Niall plugged a portable extraction device into the archive terminal. The old access codes worked. The files opened, and there it was. All of it. Encrypted messages between Morven and a chemical supplier on a neighboring world. Specifications for a compound that, when introduced into a sealed ventilation system, would cause cardiac failure in adult Selvari within 6 hours. Payment records, delivery confirmations, and a final message sent 2 days before the king and queen died. That read simply, "Proceed as planned." Niall copied everything. The extraction took 4 minutes. They sealed the terminal, reset the locks, and left the way they came. The 12-minute gap in the guard rotation had not yet closed. Ashford held the data chip in her hand as they walked back through the dark corridors. It was small enough to fit between 2 fingers, and it contained enough evidence to bring down a chancellor. But the night was not over. On the other side of the palace, Doris Wynne was making her own move. Phineas had found her in the lower kitchen that afternoon. He had told her, carefully and simply, that the chancellor was going to have her removed from the planet by morning. A contract review, a bureaucratic excuse. She would be taken to the orbital processing center and held there indefinitely. He did not tell her about the assassination. He did not tell her about Ashford's mission. He simply said, "If you want to see the child one more time, it must be tonight." Doris had not hesitated. She did not ask questions. She did not weigh her options. She simply asked, "Can you get me past the guards?" Phineas could. Ashford's team had arranged for the guards on the royal corridor to be redirected to the eastern wing during the archive operation. For a brief window, the royal quarters would be unguarded. Doris moved through the corridors with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent weeks learning every corner of this palace. She carried nothing with her except the last cloth bird she had folded that morning, a small one shaped like a swan. She reached the royal quarters. The doors were unsealed. She stepped inside. The room was dark. The silver light from the windows was faint. And in the far corner, exactly where she had found her that first night, Rena was curled on the floor. The child was shaking again. Her antennae were flat. Her silver eyes were open but unfocused. The grief spiral had returned. 3 days without Doris. 3 days of silence and sealed doors and the slow, crushing weight of loneliness had pulled her back under. Doris crossed the room. She lowered herself to the floor beside the child. Her knees ached. Her back protested. She was 56 years old and exhausted and frightened and very far from home. None of that mattered. She gathered the small violet body into her arms. Rena was cold. Her skin, normally soft and faintly warm, felt like chilled glass. Her trembling was so severe that Doris could feel it in her own bones. Doris held her tightly. She pressed the child against her chest, letting her own body heat seep into that small, shaking frame. She rocked her gently, the way she had rocked her own children decades ago. "I am here," she whispered. "I'm not leaving. Not now. Not ever." Rena's trembling slowed. Her antennae twitched. One of her small hands found the fabric of Doris's sleeve and gripped it. Then the other hand found it too. She held on with a strength that seemed impossible for such a small body. Her silver eyes focused. They found Doris's face. The keening sound in her throat faded to silence. And then, very slowly, Rena pressed her forehead against Doris's shoulder and went still. Not the stillness of grief. Not the stillness of giving up. The stillness of a child who had finally, after weeks of darkness, found something to hold on to. Doris placed the cloth swan in Rena's lap. The child's fingers closed around it without looking. She did not let go of Doris's sleeve. They sat together in the dark. Doris hummed the lullaby. Rena breathed. Across the palace, Ashford sat in her quarters and made a decision. She opened a secure communication channel. Not to the Selvari High Council. Not to a single authority that Morven could intercept or suppress. She sent the evidence to every major news network on the planet, every independent journalist, every council member's personal device, and the Galactic Labor Exchange's oversight board simultaneously. She sent it all. Every message, every payment record, every piece of proof. Then she locked her door, loaded her sidearm, and waited. By dawn, the entire planet would know what Chancellor Morven had done. By sunrise, the streets of Selvar were full. The evidence had spread faster than anyone expected. Every news network on the planet carried it. Every screen in every home displayed the Chancellor's encrypted messages, his payment records, the cold instruction that had ended the lives of a king and queen. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for denial. The words were his. The proof was absolute. Morven did not run. He was too proud for that. When the Selvari High Guard arrived at his chambers at dawn, he was sitting at his desk in full formal attire, his silver eyes flat and empty. He said nothing as they placed restraints on his wrists. He said nothing as they led him through the corridors he had walked as the most powerful man on the planet. And he said nothing as the palace doors opened and the roar of the crowd outside hit him like a wall. Thousands of Selvari stood in the crystal streets. They did not cheer. They did not shout. They simply watched in silence as the man who had murdered their king and queen was taken away. The silence was heavier than any anger could have been to Morven's allies scattered within hours. Dunn vanished off-world before noon. The false physicians withdrew their reports. Gavra, the monitor who had watched the royal quarters, resigned and disappeared. The web of corruption that Morven had built over years collapsed in a single morning. 3 days later, the Selvari High Council convened in the Great Ceremony Hall. The same hall where the funeral had been held. The same platform where Rena had stood alone and watched her parents disappear into the floor. The council confirmed what the lore required. Princess Rena was the sole surviving heir of the royal bloodline. She was the rightful future queen. A regency council would be formed to govern in her name until she came of age. Advisor Fennes, despite his age and frailty, was appointed to lead it. He accepted with a slow nod and a trembling hand. But then came the question no one had prepared for. Who will care for the child? The Selvari had traditions for this. Protocols. Institution. There were royal nurseries staffed by trained caregivers. There were educational programs designed over centuries. There were entire systems built to raise a future queen. Rena refused all of them. When the council sent a delegation to the royal quarters to discuss her care arrangements, they found the princess sitting on the floor beside a short, round human woman with graying hair. The child's hand was wrapped around the woman's sleeve. Her antennae were raised and steady. Her silver eyes were bright. The lead counselor, a tall woman named Sava, knelt before Rena and spoke gently. "Your Highness, we have prepared a team of the finest caregivers in the Dominion. They will ensure you receive everything you need." Rena looked at her. Then she looked at Doris. Then she looked back at the counselor and said, in clear but careful galactic comment, "She stays." Sava hesitated. "Your Highness, the human woman is a domestic servant. She is not trained in royal protocol or Selvari child development or she stays." Rena said it again, louder this time. Her antennae lifted high. The glow in her eyes brightened. Doris, who understood very little of what was happening, looked down at the child gripping her sleeve and gently placed her free hand over Rena's small fingers. The council debated for 2 days. Some members argued that a human could not possibly raise a Selvari princess. The cultural gap was too wide. The biological differences too significant. Others pointed out that every Selvari caregiver assigned to the child had failed, and that the human woman had succeeded where an entire palace had not. It was Fennes who settled it. He stood before the council, leaning on his cane, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried to every corner of the hall. "I have served this throne for 40 years. I have watched 3 generations of rulers, and I have never seen a child as broken as Rena was in the weeks after her parents died. She was disappearing, not slowly, quickly. The physicians will confirm it. She was deep in a grief spiral that would have destroyed her mind within months." He paused. His silver eyes moved across the council. One person stopped it. One person sat on the floor in the dark with a dying child and refused to leave. Not a physician, not a counselor, not a trained caregiver. A human woman with a cleaning rag and a lullaby. He straightened as much as his old body would allow. The child has chosen. It is not our tradition, but it is her right, and it saved her life. The council voted that afternoon. By a narrow margin, Doris Wynne was granted the title of Royal Guardian of the Air. She was given quarters beside the princess, full access to the child at all times, and a formal seat in the court. It was without precedent. A human raising a Selvari princess had never happened in the history of the Dominion. Captain Ashford and her team were offered permanent positions as the princess's personal guard. Ashford accepted without hesitation. A week later, on a warm evening when the violet sun hung low over the crystal towers of Selvar, Doris and Rena sat together on the balcony outside the royal quarters. The city stretched out below them, glowing in shades of purple and silver. The streets were full again, but this time with movement and noise and life. The palace hummed with its familiar blue glow. The walls were bright again. Rena leaned against Doris, her small body relaxed, her antennae resting gently. In her lap sat the cloth swan, worn and soft from weeks of holding. Doris began to hum the lullaby. The same melody she had hummed that first night on the cold floor in the dark. Rena listened for a moment, her silver eyes half closed. Then she began to hum along, slightly off-key, a little uncertain, but steady. Doris looked down at her and smiled. The kind of smile that only comes from a place so deep inside that words cannot reach it. "You're going to be a wonderful queen, little one," she whispered. Rena was quiet for a moment. Then she tilted her head up and looked at Doris with those bright, glowing silver eyes. "Only because you are here," she said. Doris held her a little tighter. The lullaby continued. The sun set slowly over Selvar, and somewhere in the vast, cold, endless galaxy, the smallest act of human kindness had saved the kingdom.